Welcome everyone to Analysis Group's Law and Economics Symposium webinar series. Today's panel is Economic Loss Arguments in Pharmaceutical Product Liability Class Actions. Before we get started, a few administrative items to cover. You are currently in a view-only mode and your line is muted. If you'd like to ask a question, click on the Q&A button, type your question, and press submit. If you experience technical difficulties, please submit your concern via chat and our technician will assist you. My name is Brian Ellman, and I'm a partner in Analysis Group's Washington, D.C. office. I'm joined today by an esteemed panel. Greg Ostfeld is Vice Chair of Greenberg Traudig's Pharmaceutical, Medical Device, and Healthcare Litigation Practice, and a co-chair of the firm's Chicago litigation practice. For more than 2 decades, he has focused on providing representation to clients in regulated industries with a focus on pharmaceutical and medical device companies, the financial services sector, and the consumer product sector. Greg focuses his litigation and appellate practice on class actions, product liability, and other high-stakes litigation. Tim Costi is a co-founder of Pharmacy Healthcare Solutions, which provides management consulting services in the pharmacy industry across many market segments, including pharmaceutical manufacturers, health plans, Medicare Part D plans, pharmacy benefit managers, or PBMs, pharmacies, and technology companies that support their business needs. He has 4 decades of pharmacy experience working at retail chain pharmacies and PBMs, and has participated in pharmacy and therapeutics, or P&T committees. Tim is currently or has been a member of multiple industry organizations, such as the National Council for Prescription Drug Programs, the National Association of Chain Drugstores, and the Academy of Managed Care Pharmacy. Professor Poonam Anand-Keller is the Charles Henry Jones Professor of Marketing and Faculty Director for the Center for Business, Government, and Society at the Tuck School of Business at Dartmouth. Poonam is an expert in consumer information processing and choice behavior. She studies health decision in consumer, physician, and employee contexts with a focus on designing and implementing effective communication programs. Her research in this area has been supported by organizations such as the National Institutes for Health, the National Institute for Aging, the National Cancer Institute, and the CDC. Dr. David Chan is an associate professor of health policy at Stanford University, an investigator for the Center for Healthcare Evaluation at the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs Palo Alto Healthcare System, and co-director for the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs Query Center for Policy Evaluation. David is a practicing internal medicine physician and an economist. His research draws on industrial organization, labor economics, and applied econometric principles to study how technology and information are used in healthcare and how they affect productivity and patient care. His government service includes roles as entrepreneur in residence in the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy, staff fellow in the FDA Center for Drug Evaluation and Research, and medical device fellow in the FDA Center for Devices and Radiological Health. Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. So, product liability litigation matters are nothing new for the pharmaceutical and medical device industries. Those cases typically involve allegations that exposure to a drug or device caused a particular adverse health outcome and are brought by patients who were exposed to that product and had the adverse health outcome of interest. Questions in those cases often involve issues of general causation, that is, whether there's evidence of a causal relationship between the exposure and the outcome, and specific causation, or whether a particular patient's adverse health outcome can be attributed to the exposure. In recent years, we've seen an increase in follow-on litigation cases in which plaintiffs allege that they have suffered economic losses as a result of their payment for the medical product involved in product liability matters. These cases often involve classes of plaintiffs that were not exposed to the medical product or did not have the adverse outcome. For example, insurance providers that paid for all or a portion of the cost of the product on behalf of their beneficiaries. The goal of this panel is to better understand the legal framework and the evolution of these cases alleging economic losses, as well as the various economic, clinical, industry, and consumer behavior dynamics that would guide how one should think about establishing whether or the extent to which plaintiffs in these cases may have been economically harmed. So Greg, can you start us off by explaining how these economic loss claims are evolving in pharmaceutical product liability cases? What's behind their increasing prevalence?
Sure. So what these cases have in common with a classical products liability case is there's usually an identifiable trigger event, like a recall, or more recently, we've seen citizens' petitions to the FDA giving rise to these actions. And the trigger event purports to identify a previously unknown condition or defect or impurity in the drug or product. The difference is, unlike a products liability case, you don't actually have to find a physically injured plaintiff. You don't have to have somebody who has suffered a physical adverse event. All you need is a purchaser. You also don't necessarily need to prove causation in the traditional products liability sense of demonstrating that a particular plaintiff suffered a particular physical ill effect. The theory is that the product is less valuable than the price paid due to the undisclosed condition, defect, or impurity. As for why these are becoming increasingly prevalent, I think basically it's because they're easier. It's easier to prove your case if you don't have to satisfy specific causation. And you can also bring the claim as a putative class action, where you combine the claims of thousands or even millions of purchasers under the rubric of one putative representative plaintiff. So you can get to a very high exposure event with just one named plaintiff, which creates a fair amount of settlement pressure.
Well, how have plaintiffs defined economic loss in these cases, stemming from product liability matters? What kinds of economic analyses are they providing in support of their theories?
Well, I think a good way to express this is in terms of the classic measure of damages in a breach of warranty case, which is usually defined, it varies from state to state, but it's usually expressed in some variation of the difference in value between the price of the product that was purchased as it was purchased and its value if it had been as represented or warranted. And in these economic loss products cases, the way that manifests is typically in one of two ways. Either the plaintiffs acknowledge that the product still had some value, but they say the consumer would have paid less for the product if that consumer had known all of the facts. We call that the worth less theory. And plaintiffs will typically try to prove that with some form of expert economic analysis combined with behavior, like a conjoint analysis or a similar survey tool. The more aggressive emerging trend is for plaintiffs to allege, in the case of a recalled product or a withdrawn product, that it never had any value at all at the time of sale because it was not legal to sell. So it had, according to them, it had no supply curve. There could not have been an intersection of supply and demand. That means the value was zero from the start. So they claim in that instance that the damages equal the full purchase price, and we've taken to referring to that as the worthless theory.
So how does the particular theory of economic loss, whether it be worthless or worth less, influence how your strategy from a defense perspective? How does it impact the types of experts that you would consider?
Well, for either theory, you've got one sort of common goal. Your starting point is demonstrating that most or all of the products retained most or all of their value. What that looks like will differ based on the particular theory, and it can involve a lot of intersecting fields, which is why it's great that we've got such a diverse panel in terms of fields of expertise today. You're certainly going to want an economist either way, whichever theory it is, but that's especially important if you're dealing with this worthlessness theory, because you have to explain the basic basic errors of economic theory there. That the fact that there was a recall doesn't mean that the supply curve retroactively vanishes and retroactively reduces the value to zero. You're almost certainly going to want a consumer behavior expert under either theory, but that's one that becomes more important if you're dealing with that worth less theory and you've got a conjoint analysis to deal with. You might need your own survey, or you might need somebody who can effectively criticize an existing consumer survey and show how it's methodologically flawed. You may well want an industry expert and or a regulatory expert to contextualize the triggering event and explain how recalled products still have value, both from an industry standpoint and from a consumer standpoint, and how even from a regulatory standpoint, the fact that there's been a recall doesn't mean that the regulatory agency views the product as having zero value. And you're still going to want scientific experts to address causation. Just because you don't have specific causation with physical injury doesn't mean that it ceases to matter. If you can prove that the underlying condition or the alleged defect did not affect most of the products or most consumers, that can seriously undercut plaintiffs' theory of lost economic value and the universality of that they need for a class action.
Okay, you mentioned that these types of cases are easier to bring. How are plaintiffs using their economic loss theories to support certification of class actions? And how are defendants thinking about it? Is there a way to avoid turning class certification into just a battle of the experts?
So class certification is really the whole game in these cases. If you just have a single economically injured plaintiff, the value of the case from the plaintiff's standpoint is not very high. If you can aggregate thousands or millions of the claims together, and it's just the purchase price or some portion of the purchase price for each consumer, then the dollar values get very high very fast. And the name of the game for the plaintiffs is trying to convince the court that the class members' claims, the putative class members' claims, are sufficiently similar that you can try them all together. Now, there's a lot of different class certification requirements that touch on this theme, going by names like commonality, predominance, typicality, and superiority. But the crux of it is, can all of these claims be tried together in an efficient and meaningful way, or are the differences too much to do it? So for the defendants, defeating class certification often involves coming at it from the opposite angle, convincing the court that there are too many dissimilarities, either factually or legally, to try the claims together. I think that's why we're seeing plaintiffs try out this worthlessness theory, because it makes their case seem a lot simpler. If you can convince the court that you've got a defect that's common across all products that makes them all worth zero, it looks like a fairly simple case to try. So on the defense side, you have to attack this kind of artificial simplicity. You need to demonstrate the individualized nuances as to whether a given condition exists in each instance of a specific product, and if so, how it impacts each consumer differently. Basically, you have to keep the full intrinsic value of the product front and center and focus on how any negative economic effects are rare and highly individualized. You also asked me how you keep it from becoming a battle of the experts. The best way to do that is if you can win a motion to dismiss, demonstrate a flaw in the legal theory or in the plausibility of the factual allegations. And you're almost always going to try a motion to dismiss before you delve into the class certification fight. If they get past a motion to dismiss, candidly, it's a little hard to keep it from becoming a battle of the experts. Experts are just going to play an important role in any sizable class action. And when you're dealing with, for example, a pharmaceutical product, it would be almost impossible to keep experts from being at the center of that type of litigation.
Do you think that this trend will continue to grow over time? Should we expect to see claims for economic loss accompanying future pharmaceutical and medical device product liability cases?
I think we are. I'm smiling because we've heard plaintiffs' attorneys talk about these theories at symposiums and conferences that we attend together, and they've talked about how they like them because of their simplicity and because of their value. So I think it's become popular because plaintiffs see it as a way to bring high exposure claims that are easier to prove than individual products liability claims, and to wrap more value into a single outcome, which creates settlement pressure. And for a lot of plaintiffs, at the end of the day, the name of the game is getting a valuable settlement out of the case. So I think unless and until we start to see some significant decisions knocking these theories down, meaning dismissals, denials of class certification, or the rejection of plaintiffs' experts espousing theories like the worthlessness theory, I think plaintiffs are going to keep seeing these as a good investment of their time and resources. And we've seen definitely a growth vector of these types of cases. I think that's going to continue for a little while.
Okay. Great. Thanks, Greg, for providing that context. Now let's bring in the other panelists. Dave, let's start with you. What features of healthcare markets specifically are relevant to the assessment of potential economic loss from product liability allegations?
Thank you, Brian. Yeah, I think that there are key features of the healthcare market that make this different than the typical canonical case where you're talking about a product liability. So the first feature is that consumers are usually in a position to make their own decisions when they're buying other products. In pharmaceutical markets and in healthcare markets in general, patients rely on agents, physicians in this case, to make decisions on their behalf. And physicians, as is well known, may not fully internalize their patients' preferences. Physicians are agents, but in many cases, they're imperfect agents for their patients. The second is that usually consumers pay the full price of goods that they consume. And therefore, the full price should reflect the economic value to the marginal consumer in a standard economic framework. In healthcare and pharmaceutical markets, drugs are subsidized by insurance companies. And when insurance companies and patients together pay the full price no longer reflects the economic value to the marginal consumer. And third, usually we observe prices that are paid, but in pharmaceutical markets, pricing is highly complex. The list prices are not the true prices paid by anyone, and actual prices are trade secrets. So these complicated relationships between industry players such as PBMs, insurers, formularies, and the fact that we have market power in this industry may further drive wedges between the list price and actual prices.
It's clearly a very complex industry and market segmentation. Poonam, Tim, any other thoughts on the features of healthcare markets that are important to understand?
I'll go first. Thanks for the opportunity, Brian. Healthcare markets remain different on some dimensions from other markets, but the gap is closing on other dimensions. I believe healthcare service providers remain resistant to the mass production that we observe in other markets. Whether a physician prescribes a medication depends not only on several patient factors, but the physician's personal experiences, anecdotes from other patients, peer practices, experts' opinions. You already heard about insurance factors. They all contribute to physicians assigning different values to the same drug for different patients, and also different values for, pardon me, it's telling me to stop here and I should listen. Sorry about that. But also assigning different values for the same drug for the same patient over time. So we don't observe that level of customization in other markets, and it's something that's important to consider in the legal cases that we are discussing here. On the consumer side, healthcare behavior is becoming more similar to the habits and patterns that define many other markets. Consumers used to make, I'm using consumers and patients interchangeably here. They used to make very big consequential health decisions with very little information. But today, healthcare consumers are taking control over their healthcare problems. They're investing more time in finding and getting information, as well as looking for proper methods in order to investigate more closely the healthcare information that they receive from their physicians. So I believe that consumers have and exercise more agency to assess value.
So let me jump in here with a quick comment. Just to kind of set the stage for the market, about 10% of prescriptions in the country are paid by patients directly as a cash paying customer. So obviously they're going to be influenced with their interaction with their prescriber. Then you have the other 90% that are paid in part by a third party. That could be a Medicare Part D plan, it could be commercial, workers' comp, you name it. And all those different entities will typically have a formulary that's been developed. And then along with the formulary is a benefit plan design. If you think of it as our own, as consumers, it's a copay we pay for a brand drug at the pharmacy or a generic prescription. So those are influencers that are created through the third party to attempt to influence what product selection is made with the interaction between the physician and the patient.
Got it. Now, let's break down the two primary allegations of economic loss that Greg had discussed. Claims that drugs are worth less and claims that drugs are worthless. From an economic industry, consumer behavior perspective, what do you think you need to determine whether a drug may be worth less than the amount that was paid? Poonam, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, a good question. according to the literature, whether it's the health literature, the consumer literature, as well as real world evidence, especially patient depositions, they indicate that you will get a range of value assessments in response to new risk information. And this variance is revealed in data, indicating that some physicians will continue prescribing the drug in despite new risk information, and some consumers will insist on continuing usage after learning of the new potential risk. Now, it's true that other physicians and consumers might seek a new alternative, but it would be erroneous to assume a uniform response to new risk information. I also want to say that some consumers will expend unusual efforts to find the at-risk drug, even after they learn of new potential risk information. So in sum, I believe it's really imperative to use data on expressed as well as revealed preferences to assess value.
Dave, what are the economic and clinical considerations that would be relevant here?
Great question. There are a number of economic and clinical considerations. And I also just want to say that, even though information is becoming more readily available and on public sources, I would say that clinical medicine has become increasingly complex. We have increasingly larger numbers of treatment choices to choose from. Like when I started residency, I'm not that old, like I started residency in 2005, there were some older physicians in the room, and they said, there used to be a residency interview question. If you were stuck on a desert island, what 3 antibiotics would you bring? And if you kind of reach decades back, there was actually only 1 antibiotic available. And by the 1980s, there were several kind of antibiotics available, and it was a legitimate question. And now there's just a proliferation of different drugs that you can choose from, different classes and number of drugs within the same class. So given that, it's a complicated kind of decision-making process. And you can think of this at a high level as decisions that are made along the lines of efficacy, side effects, and convenience. So in terms of efficacy, it really depends on the condition being treated. Some drugs may be used to treat more than one condition. So if this is a class action suit against one drug, you have to consider what is the condition being treated. The same drug can be used to treat heart failure, or it could be used to treat hypertension. On the side effects side, there are a wide range of side effects that vary quite a bit across drugs and patients. Sometimes you don't know what these side effects are until you've actually taken these drugs, the kind of underlying percentage or rate of these side effects, but you would actually have to experiment personally with these drugs to figure out whether this drug is working for you and whether you're having side effects for you. Third, convenience is not trivial either. Convenience, especially when we have polypharmacy nowadays and patients have to remember to take many of the drugs, the many drugs that they take, particularly among older patients. And so the dosage of the drug, the dosing frequency of the drug, and the route of the drug is of clinical significance when you're considering whether to prescribe a drug and when a patient is considering whether to take that drug. And interestingly, I would also say that regulators, even though we've had a lot of discussion in these cases about whether a drug is pure or not, regulators may kind of place more of a focus on the manufacturing aspect of a drug, the purity of a drug. But from a clinical perspective, purity may not be the main concern here. A 100% pure product may still be dangerous to some patients. For example, even though an antihypertensive may work exactly as designed by lowering somebody's blood pressure in and of itself is a potentially dangerous thing to do. Some patients, if you lower their blood pressures, they may be hypotensive and they may actually fall and hit their head. And there are many side effects to the actual clinical mechanism that you're trying to achieve.
Okay, interesting. So Tim, insurance providers play a large role in drug utilization and payment. what entity typically makes decisions or recommendations that would affect coverage decisions? And from an industry perspective, what would factor into determining whether a medical product was worth less than its price?
Well, the entity that would make those determinations would be the Pharmacy and Therapeutics Committee for the payer, PBM, insurer, one of those third-party plans. And really, when P&T committees look at say, a new product that's coming to the market, they really have a couple of decisions they want to make. One, from a clinical perspective, based on the evidence, the clinical studies, do we want to cover this drug, yes or no? And if the answer is yes, then are there any utilization management edits that we want to put on that product? Perhaps a step edit where you'd have to fail on maybe a lower cost product before you have access to the new product. Prior authorization, it's only used in certain clinical situations. So you make those decisions on whether or not it's covered with some stipulations, per se. And if that's the case, then at that point, it would go off to more of a business decision on how to slot the product and benefit designs, copay tiers, of that nature. So it's really the P&T committee that makes those decisions. They have drug monographs that are produced by their clinical staff that helps them sort through all the information that's available. And to Dave's point, the amount of information that's available today is unbelievable on even one new drug product hitting the market. So you really need some experts to summarize that information so that the committee can make a fairly quick and informed decision on whether or not that product should be covered.
Would the dynamics of the particular therapeutic market be relevant to the coverage decisions that are made when new information arises pertaining to a particular drug? For example, Dave had referred to multiple other available drugs. Would that be relevant to an insurance provider or P&T committee when they're thinking about their coverage decisions when faced with new information about a drug?
Yes, absolutely. You look at what are the therapeutic alternatives. Is this a limited issue with one supplier of the product, perhaps? And then based on that input, the P&T committee decision would be, do we want to jump in and influence this? What was the FDA? Is there a recall? Is it a voluntary? Is it a mandatory? All those components come into play to decide what action to take. And oftentimes, my experience has been the P&T committee will take direction from the FDA based on their latest research and recommendations, and typically will mirror that until new information perhaps is available.
Okay. Now let's think about the claims of worthlessness of these drugs. As Greg had referred to, plaintiffs have argued in some cases that because manufacturing didn't meet certain regulatory requirements, there was no legitimate supply of a drug. If there was no legitimate supply of the drug, does that mean that the value of the drug was zero? And relatedly, from an economic or real world perspective, do you have an understanding of what is meant by a lack of quote unquote legitimate supply? Dave?
Great question. I think there is not a kind of economic underpinning, I think, to this this term legitimate supply. I think there is a supply curve, and the supply curve exists for a number of different reasons. It exists, not only based on regulatory considerations, but it exists based on the other players in the market, the cost of producing a drug. When I think about worthlessness as an economist, I think about willingness to pay. And again, this really relies on a canonical economic framework where somebody is revealing that how much money they would pay for a product that they fully understand. So it's a more complicated concept in the healthcare sector, but still, I think the fundamental underpinning of this is willingness to pay. And this, how much a given patient, how much a drug, has value to a given patient would, in principle, depend on all of the things I just mentioned before: efficacy, side effects, and convenience. And when you aggregate all of those patients' willingness to pay, you'll get a demand curve. So to me, as an economist, the concept of the worth of a product, it really kind of is encapsulated in the demand curve and not a supply curve.
Poonam, what do you think about this? I know that you have many thoughts on these demand curves.
First, I agree with what Dave just said. But in general, I believe the concept of legitimate supply is moot when consumers have experienced the product. Consumers, I mean, it's just circular logic. If consumers have experienced the product, there was supply. So you can't just wave a wand and say there was no supply, and therefore we cannot calculate price because even if we have a demand curve, there's no supply curve. So we resort to the original price. That just doesn't make sense because there was a product, consumers experienced the product, they gained value from the product. And the only way the value of the drug would be zero is if the entirety of the value generated from the drug was destroyed completely by one feature, the increased impurity, without considering any other feature, such as the therapeutic value of the drug for the patient. So I agree with what Greg said earlier, that this approach is overly simplistic, and it does not account for the realities of the healthcare decision-making process, both from the physician's perspective as well as the consumer's perspective. It is more likely that many consumers utilized a more holistic decision-making process, what we call in academic a compensatory decision-making process, and would still attribute significant positive value to the drug after becoming aware of the new impurities and re-evaluating their consumption of those drugs. So as I said earlier, I also agree with Dave. This is a demand curve issue, and to understand potential economic damages to consumers, one would need to adjust the demand curve to reflect the fact that consumers might value the drug containing more impurities differently than the drug containing less impurities. Notice I didn't say pure, impure. It's just a matter of level of impurity. And what, if I had to sum it, you would need to understand the impurities' idiosyncratic impact on demand. And you would end up creating multiple demand curves to reflect heterogeneity in consumers' assessments of value after learning about the new impurities. There would be some consumers for whom it would have an insignificant or no impact on the demand curve due to factors such as serious health consequences, experience with trying alternative drugs and finding that it does not suit them, preference for monotherapy, amongst other factors. Whereas for some other consumers, it might have a moderate or even a higher level of impact on the demand curve. But I think it would be erroneous to assume a single demand curve or no supply curve.
That's really interesting. And one of the things that you mentioned was that there might be an adverse outcome associated with not having taken these drugs. You know, many drugs are often paid for by insurance providers so that they can avoid other costs. You know, for example, surgeries or hospitalizations. Tim, is this all consistent with your experience and, you know, with respect to how one should really think about this?
Yes, it is, Brian. All those factors go into the evaluation of the drugs and the decision. You know, once the issue has been identified in the marketplace, you know, from an industry perspective, I'm challenged with this, you know, it really happened, but it didn't happen argument being made about the supply curve, because patients did get those medications, they took them, they received therapeutic benefit from them. And then once the issue was identified, then the industry has a regulatory component that was able to address it. So I think, all those cost avoidance issues, keeping people out of the hospital, adverse effects from the therapeutic benefit of those drugs needs to be considered when evaluating what that drug is worth.
Now, a lot of what we've been talking about and a lot of the theories that plaintiffs' theories for economic loss that we've been talking about seem to come from two different perspectives, meaning whether the valuation of the drug should be determined prospectively or retrospectively. For example, should economic loss be based on the difference between what I paid and the amount that I would have paid had I known about an alleged risk at the time of purchase, or if the drug wasn't available at all? Or would economic loss be based on the difference between what I paid and my ex post assessment of the value that I received from taking the drug? Greg, is there a legal standard for how we should be thinking about these valuations?
Well, in true lawyerly fashion, I'll preface this by saying that the legal standard is going to vary a great deal based on the particular claim asserted and which state you are in. So what Iowa would say under a warranty claim might be very different from what New York would say under a consumer protection claim. That said, I would say the significant majority of jurisdictions and claims would view this from a retrospective point of view. You want to know what the difference in value is between what was purchased and what was received as measured from the time of purchase. You'll sometimes hear this expressed in terms of like a benefit of the bargain standard or a regret not being an injury standard. If you got what you paid for at the time of sale, the fact that you later regretted the purchase is not necessarily an economic loss. The challenge becomes drawing the line between economic loss at the time of sale and post-sale regret. And that can get a little bit muddy in terms of whether new information means that you didn't get what you bargained for at the time of purchase, or whether it just means that with the benefit of hindsight, you will think you would have paid less as of today.
So I think, Poonam, that's Greg just teed it up for you. What do you think?
Well, based on what I discussed earlier, it is not going to come on as a surprise to anyone that I'm on team prospective. It's really important to think about how the full spectrum of consumers would distinctly react to the new risk information instead of making assumptions that the drug would be worth less or worthless. And it's clear that evidence indicates that consumers discount the incremental risk due to therapeutic benefits, resistance to change due to suboptimal experiences with other drugs, and different levels of risk tolerance. So I think it's dangerous to make assumptions that everybody would believe that they would pay less, would not pay anything, leave alone pay less.
Tim, what do you think based off of how the industry would think about it?
Well, I briefly mentioned the prospective P&T committee viewpoint and the decision process there. But if you think in the industry, what is a retrospective opinion of a drug's value? And really the only thing I can point to would be a value-based contract where the manufacturer and the payer have gone together to look at a drug and said, all right, this may be a new expensive drug, and the payer wants to mitigate risk on paying for something that doesn't work for a patient. The manufacturer wants to get real world evidence of how that works in actual patients in the community. So there are value-based contracts that are being developed and have been developed. And one of the challenges has been, what is the clinical metric we're going to use to measure that contract? How long does it take that therapy to affect that metric? And is it easily measured and reported upon in the data that's normally collected, in the healthcare system? So you have all these items that put a very difficult perspective on a clean contract. You're sitting down from a contract negotiation perspective, we're going to have to define all these terms, when it's going to happen, what's the cohort of patients, what's success, what's not success. So really from a retrospective evaluation in the industry, there hasn't been much done in the past and is only an emerging market today with those value-based contracts.
Dave, how do you think about this from an economic and clinical perspective?
Yes, I think it's a fascinating question. I think here, it's where kind of this idea of you get what you paid for, or warranties, may not map to kind of what we actually think about clinically. In clinical practice, there is a ton of heterogeneity and there is a ton of uncertainty. So we make decisions whether to approve a drug or whether to include a drug on the formulary, even though there's substantial heterogeneity on what are the average effects of that drug. We have some clinical trial evidence, but we haven't, this is kind of the nature of drug development. You gather information after you've approved the drug. You have a certain amount of information that you think it might be a safe drug for the general population or for a certain indication, and you approve the drug, but you still gather information after you approve the drug. And this is for a policy decision. Now, for an individual clinical decision, there's even more uncertainty. Even though on average, a drug might lower blood pressure and have good effects, on kidneys or on hearts, for a specific patient, oftentimes in medicine, we say that a treatment could save your life or the treatment could kill you. The same drug might have heterogeneous effects on different patients. And we have plenty of examples in clinical medicine where we have treatments that potentially could harm patients, but could also help some patients. And we have this uncertainty, and this is kind of what we do in clinical medicine. So for example, chemotherapy may improve the survival of under cancer, but it may cause life-threatening complications. Anticoagulation for atrial fibrillation could prevent stroke, but could also cause life-threatening bleeding. A CT scan, just a radiology test, could reveal valuable information, but it could expose patients to radiation that may cause cancer down the line. So in clinical medicine, it's hard to think about what we mean by did you get what you pay for, or what's a warranty for a given treatment. And I think this is why it's very much prospective in my viewpoint, because we're making dynamic decisions. We're not committing a patient to a treatment regardless of what happens. We're first thinking the patient might have a decent chance of benefiting from this treatment. Then we're monitoring whether that treatment works or not. What are the side effects of that treatment? And we're changing our decisions. There's always the possibility that a treatment can make a patient worse off, but that is what we do in clinical medicine. We manage the patient dynamically.
Mm-hmm. So Poonam, you've already talked a little bit about the role of consumer behavior in establishing or thinking about potential economic losses in these types of matters. What we haven't talked about is how that information is conveyed to consumers. Can the method in which information is conveyed to consumers impact their valuation or reaction to a previously undisclosed negative attribute of a drug?
Oh, definitely. How and what information is conveyed to consumers by whom has a significant impact on consumer reactions to a, in this context, previously undisclosed negative attribute of a drug. How, for example, how the potential presence of impurities is communicated to consumers would impact their retrospective valuations of the drug. If a consumer was told that the drug contained a probable human carcinogen, for example, without any further context, they would be more likely to weigh the impurity more negatively than if the consumers were informed that the impurity was something that they may be exposed to, from water, meats, dairy products, vegetables, and other things that they would consume daily. So I think that who is conveying the information, whether they are finding the information on the internet, whether they're learning about the information from a government website, whether they are learning about the information from their physicians, and some combination of all of the above would have a huge impact on their risk and value assessment.
And so, Greg had mentioned that plaintiffs often put forward conjoint surveys, to try to tease out the economic loss. Is what we're talking about here the method in which patients are informed of this new negative attribute of the drug? Is that important to think about when you're designing a survey or doing any of these types of analyses?
Oh, definitely, and I'll combine it with how Dave just described the decision-making process for physicians and the role of consumers in that decision-making process. It is a dynamic, multifaceted process, which reveals that consumers and physicians share decision-making, and it would be wrong to think about it as a binary process where, if someone says, yes, it's positive value, or no, it's negative or zero value for any one feature, because what you're really doing is making assessments across multiple features. So in a conjoint way, you're taking a subset of features and in typically only drug features and varying levels of it, what the results you would get would be erroneous because you're not considering a lot of the non-drug factors, such as the consumer's lifestyle, whether they're consuming alcohol or smoking cigarettes or other comorbidities that they may have that would have an impact of the value of the drug. And I think that you have to be very, very careful to understand the context, as well as, and this includes the patient's complete health, rather than just manipulating different levels of a particular drug feature.
Dave, what do you think from your experience and expertise? What does this align with how you would think about it? Absolutely.
Yeah, I think Poonam really kind of described the complexity of this and the fact that this is shared decision making. Asking consumers what drug they would take while presenting them kind of streamlined information on two separate dimensions is not really kind of how patients make their decisions. They make their decisions with the help of physician expertise. Physicians and patients in turn kind of make their decisions in the context of guidelines and P&T committee recommendations. So it's a complicated landscape of decision making in healthcare, and simply asking patients a question of how they would weigh one feature versus another is not realistic.
So Tim, I think Dave just invoked you. Do you agree?
Absolutely. From a pharmacy experience, and I'm a pharmacist by training, you have the whole gamut of consumer behaviors and responses to different inputs. And, people are risk averse, people are risk taking, and fall along that spectrum. And again, with their input from their prescribing physician, then they'll jointly make a decision on what strategy to take.
Well, I think this leads naturally to the question of class certification. One criterion for class certification is that the fact and extent of harm can be established on a class-wide basis without significant individualized assessment. So, Greg, from a legal perspective, how is significant individualized assessment defined?
Thanks. So I mentioned earlier, there's a variety of legal factors that are applied formally in a class certification context. The idea of an individualized assessment is probably best captured by two of those factors, commonality and predominance. And commonality essentially means there have to be issues of law or fact that can be answered in common for most or all of the class members. And predominance requires that these common issues predominate over individual issues in the case. So when you're talking about significant individualized assessment, the question the court is essentially asking in pragmatic terms is, do I or does the jury have to look at the individual circumstances of each class member to resolve this case, or can the case be decided based on evidence common to the class as a whole? So what plaintiffs want is for this to be very binary. Either a drug is good for everyone in the class or it's bad for everyone in the class. Either it has value or it has no value. And on the defense side, you want to draw out the kind of dynamic complexity that we've been talking about when decision-making involves an interaction of physician and consumer, when it involves, the degree to which a drug is good or bad is a variable, and impurity can only be one of many factors taken into consideration, that even a pure drug can have good and bad, and that it becomes a clinical and a consumer decision about whether it's the right drug for the patient and whether the drug has value for that patient. So that's the kind of dynamics and complexity you want to draw out to defeat class certification.
So in terms of all of the dynamic characteristics that would be relevant here, what do you think the factors are that would be relevant to this kind of assessment, of how patients, physicians, insurance providers make decisions that affect the likelihood and extent of economic loss in product liability matters? Tim, do you have thoughts on this?
I do. I think when you look from an industry perspective, people always point to the pharmacy record. You go to the pharmacy, you get a prescription filled, goes through your insurance. There's a record of what happened. But the thing to keep in mind is the record is the final result of all those decisions we've been talking about previously that influence what happened. So, it tells you what happened. It doesn't tell you why it happened. And the why it happened is what's critical in these cases, in my mind.
Yeah, Dave, what do you think?
Yeah, I think absolutely. This is very, I'll just kind of repeat what I said earlier. These are individual clinical decisions that that are being made, and from a clinician, for if you're trying to kind of model how the worth of a drug to a patient and how the decisions being made, these are going to consider the individual patient characteristics.
Right. Poonam, any thoughts?
I believe it's difficult to create a class when there is significant consumer and physician heterogeneity within and across consumers and physicians.
Yeah, and I guess how each of these decision makers would respond to the same new information, whether there would be differences in their reactions and ultimately in their valuations of the drug. Is that right?
That's right. I mean, we unfortunately, we've all been patients, and we know that our value assessment varies even for the same drug over time. We may physicians typically start off with a smaller dosage, and we might think the drug is completely worthless because nothing is happening. And then we get to a point where for the same drug over time, the same patient, where we find that that it's having a positive impact on our health, and it has some value. And so it's non-monotonic, where it starts low, goes up, and then as Dave explained in one of his previous examples, over time, we might start experiencing some side effects or some unexpected serious health consequences that makes us devalue the drug. And so this is just one example of heterogeneity in value assessment, even for the same drug, for the same patient, with the same physician.
Now, for certain therapeutic markets, government payers, for example, Medicare, Medicaid, may play a particularly large role in the coverage of prescription drugs. If government payers are excluded from the class, how might that complicate the assessment of the prices that were actually paid by class members? Tim, what do you think?
Well, you bring up a good point on Medicare Part D. It's a federally funded program, depending on whether it's a prescription drug program only or it's part of a Medicare Advantage plan. But if you think about it, The Medicare Part D program was created in the early 2000s. When it was initially discussed, one of the issues in the industry was, well, you want to capitate a drug program and you want us to accept risk for that capitated payment to take care of all those drugs that members are going to take. And in the industry back in the 1990s, there were a number of HMOs that capitated pharmacy programs. And I can tell you from personal experience, there was a lot of money lost as the pharmacies figured out that, boy, we don't control the power of the pen, what's being prescribed and how it's being prescribed. So all those things came into factor when Med D was being created, and CMS eventually started minimizing risk for plans because of all those components I just mentioned. Mm-hmm. So when you look at a Part D plan, approximately 75% of the payment for prescriptions is through funding from the Supplemental Insurance Trust Fund. And the other 25% typically comes from a beneficiary premium. So the amount at risk is very minimal based upon those financing dynamics of Medicare Part D. In addition, you have the catastrophic coverage where, again, to help minimize risk for the plan, the catastrophic coverage was if we have a very expensive patient, then the plan's really only on the hook for 15% of that cost. The patient picks up 5% and the government picks up the other 80%. So you have all these factors that when you look at the final result, well, you know what was paid, but you don't know who funded that payment that eventually went to the pharmacy.
So I guess that kind of goes back to what the first part of our discussion is, what makes healthcare markets different is because of the variety of entities that are involved in a purchase of a prescription or in what we've been discussing previously in decision-making processes. It's actually by nature of the complex flow of funds that go towards paying for prescriptions. This is actually something that would make it even difficult to identify what prices were paid and who bore those costs. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct. And one thing I didn't mention, which I will now, is there's also retrospective adjustments for Med D, for example. The pharmacy industry has been railing against the DIR fees that are a clawback that could happen, 6 to 9 months after the prescription is filled. And it's a per prescription clawback from the pharmacy based on metrics in their contract with the Med D plan. So in the next year, in 2024, the industry is going to require that the Med D plans or their processors to identify at the point of sale for the pharmacy what that likely DIR fee is going to be. And it'll be interesting to see what happens, because at that point in time, pharmacies could say, you know what, I'm going to lose a lot of money on this prescription. Do I really want to fill it for the patient? So you have all these factors that go into people's decision making and what's the responsibility for each party in the supply chain.
In some cases, plaintiffs have proposed class definitions based on specific levels of exposure to a drug. In terms of, for example, if patients took a drug sold by a specific manufacturer over a specified period of time at specific dosage levels. So actually, Dave, I'm going to throw this out to you first. What are potential complications in determining actual exposures or exposure levels to a drug?
Yes, I think it's quite a, knowing, especially for drugs that, there's many manufacturers of the drugs, there's different batches of the drugs. It seems very hard to to know, to trace back, what exactly which drug did the patient take, from what batch did it come from. So I think at best we can form some type of average estimate, but it's not going to be the exact exposure that a patient had to a given drug. There's also questions of, we know that patients are prescribed drugs, but they may not actually take the drugs, and at quite high rates. It could be as much as 30% what we call non-adherence to drugs. So that's another complication, whether you're actually taking the drugs or not. And this is kind of an active field of research. It's a huge policy issue of whether patients actually take the drugs that they're prescribed. And that's just getting at the very simple question of how much of an impurity a patient is exposed to. There's the more important question of what did that amount of impurity cause for that patient?
Unfortunately, we've now come to the end of our time. I'd like to thank each of our panel members, Greg Ostfeld, Poonam Keller, David Chan, and Tim Costi, for a very interesting and lively discussion, as well as everyone who joined us today. Have a great rest of your day and happy holidays.